just have confirmed the death of a Blackstone executive. Her name is Wesley LaPotner.
The Blackstone business executive was among the 4 people killed in Monday's shooting rampage in Midtown.
So if you scroll through the comments of these videos, you'll see that Wesley LaPotner's death wasn't mourned by anyone. So what exactly did this evil CEO do? After the 2020 crash, Blackstone and other PE firms started buying real estate around the Sunbelt states. And fast forward to today, and the average homes in previously affordable areas like Atlanta and Florida are, well, no longer affordable. But hold on, that makes zero sense. I thought private equity was providing high-level solutions to the housing crisis, or at least that's what the CNBC video would have you to believe.
We've invested $425 million of capital since we acquired Stuytown. That shows up in lots of different ways.
So obviously I wasn't gonna get answers from a gluck session for private equity. So I wanted to explore all sides to find out the truth about this housing crisis. But what I found goes beyond the rise of corporate landlords. Private equity has turned housing into a high-stakes bet that now millions of everyday people are playing in, and you have zero idea about it. And if the private equity game spreads to the entire US housing market, well, I'll let you take a guess on what could happen next.
Infiltration of investors into the California housing market. And honestly, it shows no signs of slowing down.
If you give these guys money, they're gonna f***ing buy your mum's house. That is what they're gonna do.
People can't afford homes anymore. And if the American dream means owning your own place, then that dream is a fantasy.
So before we dive in, let me get the fear mongering that you're probably thinking about out the way. No, this is not going to lead to another 2008 style global financial meltdown. But there are real stakes for you that go beyond you possibly never being able to own a home. And to understand this, you first need to see what private equity is actually doing in the housing market and why their business model might be a ticking time bomb. And to explore all sides, I wanted to bring on a vice president at a private equity real estate firm to say his piece.
I've been working on Wall Street since 2013, both on the investment side and obviously also in a residence side too.
You used to work at Blackstone, right? Or was it BlackRock?
I was at BlackRock. It was my first job out of college, and it was an amazing experience, but I wasn't on the real estate side then. Currently, I work at a real estate company where we buy and develop real estate. 80% of our portfolio is in housing across multifamily, senior housing, and manufactured housing.
And I'm guessing also there's probably more money in private equity real estate, right?
Well, not right now. The market's been pretty tough because interest rates are so high. And on the other side, I'd say that real estate is more on the stagnant side.
So we'll come back to him, but first, let me explain to you how firms like Blackstone are making money as America's landlord. In my private equity video, I showed you how firms like Blackstone buy a bunch of companies using leveraged buyouts. And they're doing the same for real estate. So let's say as private equity, you can buy 1,000 homes for $100 million. Private equity will put like 20% of their own money and borrow the rest from banks, like JP Morgan. So once they own the homes, tenants obviously start moving in and ideally start paying rent every single month. But here's where it gets interesting. They then take those 1,000 homes generating $10 million per year, let's say, and bundle it into a bond to sell to investors worldwide. And what happens next is pension funds, wealthy individuals, and now even universities start buying a slice of this bond to get monthly payouts from the rent plus interest. I'll get to all that later. But anyways, these are called rental-backed securities. And your rent payment just became a part of a global financial product. Then the cycle continues where private equity uses that money to buy up more homes. And just like when they buy up a bunch of companies, they borrow a bunch of money so they can buy a bunch of these homes faster. And just like with companies, if home values or rents start going up, so do their profits. But that's not even how they make the real money. So is it fair to say that you probably make the most from those performance fees?
I would say in a good market and your investments are doing well, the performance fees are generally like where you will make a lot of the money. But if the market's not doing very well, then the asset management fees will really keep the lights on and pay the salaries and things like that.
But the thing is, this performance fee only gets taxed 20% instead of the regular 37% income tax rate. And I'll also get into this later, but it's a loophole they fought hard to protect. So it's important you understand this to grasp the incentives at play here, because at scale, this now starts impacting entire neighborhoods. Because when private equity buys up a bunch of homes, they also are making bulk deals with home builders. And it's a big reason why all these corporate towns and luxury apartments all look the goddamn same. And also why they might start using smaller lot sizes and cheaper materials to maximize profit. But to be fair, I don't think many Americans really give a shit about beauty, but what everyone from any country gives a shit about is getting screwed on price. Because remember those damn fees? Well, private equity also passes down fees on top of rent to renters. Online payment fees, pet fees, admin fees, transaction fees. Like, look at all these bullshit ass fees on my own rent payments. But that's not all. Many large landlords use algorithmic pricing software like RealPage to set rent prices. In fact, there are ongoing lawsuits alleging this leads to price coordination between competing landlords.
Corporate landlords collude with each other to set artificially high rental prices.
But you might think, well, don't airlines do the same thing too? Yes, but it becomes a problem when private equity concentrates in a small area where now entire neighborhood prices get jacked up by algorithms setting these competing prices. Because even though private equity today only owns 4% of homes nationally, it's a different story when you look at this map. What you see is that it isn't spread evenly. It's concentrated in specific markets. Over half are in just 5 states: Florida, California, Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas, where I live. Actually, I don't know if I should be revealing where I live, considering I just got hacked in my last video.
I think we have your apartment.
What?
The address.
Okay, prove it.
Does this look familiar to you?
What the fuck? Wait, what? That's literally where I'm sitting right now. But goddamn it, whatever. It's important for this video because where I live in Austin, private equity owns more than 25% of all apartments or multi-family homes. And when it comes to single family homes in some Atlanta neighborhoods, Wall Street landlords own 1 out of every 5 houses on the block. So I'm sure you're wondering, and I wanted to know, but why this Sunbelt area?
I think that fundamentally, it's really just around supply and demand dynamics. On the demand side, we typically look at markets with strong job growth and strong population growth. And so the Sunbelt markets, they offer the trifecta of business-friendly regulation, landlord-friendly environments, and a lower cost of living and like a higher quality of life relative to New York City or San Francisco. And so those are all like the different pieces of what encourages capital investments for major employers. They're going to relocate their headquarters to these cities, like Elon relocating Tesla to Austin, and they're going to open new offices, build manufacturing plants. And the ripple effect of this is that infrastructure investments are made through new roads, new schools, hospitals, and obviously in the forms of housing. And I think that the next frontier will be the smaller cities that have these traits and characteristics. So cities like Knoxville or Chattanooga, Indianapolis, Northwest Arkansas, like these cities have characteristics that are very similar to Austin.
So point is, it might be 4% now, but it's only growing every year, and it all started from 2008. Before, private equity had almost no footprint in single-family homes. But once the crash happened, they swooped in to buy the 8 million foreclosed homes. Since then, they've established a pattern, taking advantage of every crisis to buy at fire sale prices. So again, it may not create a 2008 level collapse, but when you're playing with this much debt, it's clear housing has turned into a high stakes financial game. And when the game goes wrong, it's not gonna be the players who pay the price. It's the people like you who just need a place to live. But here's a twist, and where things start getting a bit ironic. Because while private equity can play around with unlimited debt, you and I can't just start slinging debt to pay rent or cover other debts that we might have, like student loans. In fact, if you have too much debt and you can't pay it back, you can't even get approved to rent an apartment in the first place. So if you're feeling buried now, check out our sponsor, PDS Debt. They've helped thousands get out of credit cards, personal loans, collections, and even medical bills. They can start saving you money now and pay off your debt in a fraction of the time. And this isn't some one-size-fits-all. They actually listen and create a customized plan for you. PDS Debt doesn't care about your credit score. They care about getting you out of debt. That's why they have an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau, hundreds of 5-star Google reviews, and a 5-star rating on Trustpilot. So stop living in debt, get your free assessment, and find the best option for you right now at pdsdebt.com/get. You're just 30 seconds away from starting to get out of debt. But speaking of debt, private equity isn't just loading themselves up with it. They found a way to turn your rent into debt too. Because remember those rental-backed securities that I mentioned earlier? The bonds that turn your rent into a global financial product? Well, what if I told you that private equity has perfectly crafted a system where regular people are unknowingly funding their own housing crisis? Take Cal PERS and Cal STRS, California's massive public employee pension systems. So put simply, retirement savings of teachers, firefighters, and police officers are now major investors in private equity real estate funds. In fact, throw in state pensions from New York and Florida that are in there too. And you might ask, why the hell are pension fund managers doing this? Well, it's because they view rentals as an asset class that can yield strong results to pay out future benefits. And since they're playing with people's retirement money, pension fund managers are required to seek steady long-term returns, but also since they're incentivized to outperform benchmarks for their own bonuses. So if it's working, then what can you say? But here's the irony. Workers' own retirement dollars might be used to price themselves out of their own homes. In 2018, California had a ballot measure, Proposition 10, that would have allowed cities to expand rent control. And Blackstone spent $5.6 million to defeat it. But here's the kicker. That money didn't come from Blackstone's corporate treasury. It came directly from the investment funds financed by public pension systems. So Californian teachers and city employees that are already struggling with high rents themselves unknowingly funded a campaign to defeat stronger renter protections. But it's not just pension funds. Endowments from elite universities like Harvard and Yale and others are also investing heavily in private equity real estate funds. And even charitable foundations are getting in on the action. The Conrad Prebies Foundation in San Diego sold 5,800 affordable homes to Blackstone to diversify assets and maximize returns for philanthropy. But like I've been mentioning throughout, what most don't know is that private equity has turned local housing into this global financial product. Sovereign wealth funds from Singapore, Norway, and the Middle East have stakes in US rental housing, and they also invested heavily in the post-2008 collapse. So my goddamn bullshit admin fees might be flowing to a pension fund in Canada or an oil fund in Norway. And if I decide not to pay my rent, I'm fucking your grandma in Canada. So what firms like Blackstone understand better than anyone is that at the end of the day, money talks the loudest game. And it's how private equity has infiltrated themselves in almost every facet of American life. And now they're doing increasingly the same with housing. But as you'll see, this machine can only function with protection. Because in order to build a web of money and power, you need to make sure the rules and, most importantly, perception stay in your favor.
I've got to go. I've got some holiday cheer to spread.
And this is where you'll really see how private equity has built their power. Because as this housing affordability crisis has gained national attention, so has real estate lobbying. Major landlord associations has doubled their federal lobbying spending between 2019 and 2023, like the National Apartment Association that upped their spending from 1.5 million to 2.2. And the goal? To steer policymakers away from tenant protections toward industry-friendly solutions. Perfect case in point is when the Biden administration rolled out a Renters' Bill of Rights in 2023, landlord lobbies reacted just as swiftly. A coalition of 20+ real estate groups sent an open letter opposing new federal regulations, warning that measures like rent control would be counterproductive to housing supply. But recently, there's been renewed threats, and it's actually not what I showed you in the intro. because it appears that the suspect was actually targeting the NFL office, and it just so happened that Blackstone's office was in the same building. So instead, the threat might be coming from this guy.
Tonight, we made history. I will be your Democratic nominee for the mayor of New York City.
Because think about that for a second. A socialist is now on his way to potentially become mayor of the most capitalistic city in the world. And one of his policy promises was to implement rent control in one of the most expensive cities to live in. So this got me thinking, is rent control the solution to this whole housing crisis? So let me make it clear, I'm definitely no socialist, but you live in New York City, and in recently the mayor race, and one of the things that he ran on was rent control policies. How effective do you think are rent control policies in solving these rising house cost issues?
What you believe is just an effect of like how you grew up in the world and how you've seen the world, right? But to, I guess, address the question sort of directly is maybe take a step back and understand how pricing and rent control works, right? The landlord is limited by how much they can increase their rent annually, and that's tied to inflation. And so the benefit of this is that tenants get long-term stability. It'll shield them from market volatility, being displaced from their homes that you talked about earlier. But I think a downside of this is that new construction is exempt and discouraged as a result. And so when you don't have new construction, it's really hard for prices to come down. And obviously there's many sides to a story. For someone who does have a rent control department in New York City, that's amazing for them, right? Because they get to keep their units affordable for many years, maybe generations if they pass it down. But it limits mobility. They're stuck in that same apartment, right? And it could be a neglected unit because the landlord doesn't have any incentive to renovate or further invest into that home. Especially in New York City, there are 26,000 rent stabilized apartments that are intentionally set vacant because it's easier for the landlord to just keep it empty than to operate it as a loss. Another case study is St. Paul, Minnesota. So that's a city that has showed negative side effects of rent control. So in 2021, right after COVID, the voters put in a strict 3% cap on annual rent increases. Now, that immediate effect is that new construction plummeted by 80% the following year. I think rent control has very positive intentions, but the side effects may not be as positive. I do believe that the way to fix housing is to add supply. We talked about Austin, right? And you live in Austin, I lived in Austin. Rents are down 20% from the peak because there's so much supply. You look outside your window, there's just cranes everywhere. There's no rent control in Austin. In fact, Texas explicitly prohibits any sort of rent control, right? But they encourage development through policy and regulation.
So it remains to be seen what happens, but suggestions like rent control is a big reason why private equity pours money into politics. It's why at the federal level, the American Investment Council PAC, private equity's main lobbying arm that represents giants like Blackstone, Apollo, Carlyle, and KKR, continues to donate a lot of money, but to both parties. And they especially target members of tax writing and finance committees. Because remember that carried interest loophole that lets private equity pay 20% instead of 37% of their profits? But again, lobbying is just one part of their strategy. Because lobbying usually only works until the public gets so loud that politicians can't afford to keep siding with the lobbyists. And it's arguably a big reason why private equity is increasingly spending more money on PR. Because look, this is just pure speculation, but why do you think CNBC went from making videos like this a few years ago?
What's behind the rise of corporate landlords? And how, if at all, will the government regulate them?
To then making something like this just last month.
Blackstone expects to be the single largest provider of affordable housing in the United States.
We're feeling like we're just getting started.
And it doesn't end there. Blackstone has even released a glossy memo titled Housing Market, Myth versus Fact to reframe the narrative. So let's read some of these together. Okay, myth 1, we own less than 1% of rental housing in the US. Well, now it's 4%. And since 2011, it's been a 40x increase, and that number is only going to keep going up. In fact, in 2024, Blackstone closed a $30 billion real estate fund, their largest ever, and 15% of all new single-family homes are now built specifically as rentals, most backed by institutional capital. Okay, now let's move on to 2. We have virtually no ability to impact market rent trends. Okay, come on, that's not even remotely true, especially in local markets. 3 out of 10 rage bait. Okay, this third one where they highlight investments in affordable housing developments. So that is true, but In recent years, they have started pivoting away from that towards more higher income tenants like build-to-rent suburban homes, since these returns are higher. And finally, housing prices are high due to lack of supply, not because we're buying homes. Well, this one is actually a fair argument, as I'll get into next. But point is, the goal is to convince policymakers and the public that Wall Street ownership is good. But if private equity is such a small player and planning to remain that way, then why are they spending millions to protect a system that supposedly has no impact? I mean, the answer is simple. Because they know what's coming. And they do that better than anyone. That's why they're rich as fuck and you're not. So now the most important question becomes, what will happen to housing in the years to come? Because I think anyone can agree that housing has fundamentally been broken since 2008. So what is the solution? I guess the best place to start is asking, is private equity to blame for this crisis? How do you gauge whether private equity is for better or worse for the housing market?
Yeah, I always say that there's multiple sides to a story, right? And the criticism of private equity is generally emotionally charged, and I empathize with that because homes have very sentimental values to people. My parents just recently moved last year, and it was sad to say goodbye to the house that I grew up in. And there are many arguments that discourage private equity, right? I would say the main one is that private equity is crowding out first-time home buyers by purchasing these homes in bulk with cash offers. That's one less home for a family to own. Another argument is that there's an ethical concern. These firms are treating homes as tradable financial assets, not places where people will be able to raise their family. And there's obviously concerns of private equity owners that jack up rents for the sole purposes of their profits. So I see all of these criticisms of private equity and I empathize with that. And then on the flip side, in terms of like why private equity can be positive for the housing environment, the first is around this market stabilization that we talked about earlier, putting a floor on housing prices when home prices are crashing. And I would say that private equity plays two pivotal roles. One is around investments and the second around operations. So on the investment side, there's an emerging asset class, the asset class that I've been working in since 2021 called build for rent. And so this is where investors will come in and buy plots of land in suburban areas to develop purpose-built communities of single-family rental homes. These are communities that have amenities, so like pools, dog parks, fitness centers, and they offer renters the ability to raise their families in a neighborhood with good schools, access to jobs that maybe they couldn't otherwise afford because of their FICO scores, student loans that they took out. And there's only 300,000 of such these units. And you compare this to 24 million multifamily apartments. So it's very nascent. But I think there's a very positive aspect of private equity because it's allowing the system to grow, it's adding new supply, and it's creating new homes for people to live in and enjoy and raise their families. The second is really just around driving operational efficiencies, right? So if you're a homeowner and your dishwasher broke, like it's expensive for you to go to Home Depot, get a new one, get it shipped, replace it, right? And so institutions, because they operate at scale, they have dedicated property management, 24/7 service lines, technology-enabled leases, right? And so there are these two aspects around both the investments and the operations that actually can be good for the housing market.
And so what's clear is that the biggest problem that this all comes down to is shortage. But it's shortage of the right kind of housing. That's the main problem. And private equity obviously has no incentive to fix that. In the 1970s, we built 418,000 entry-level homes per year. And in 2020, just 65,000. We've been underbuilding for decades, which has led to a shortage of 4 to 8 million homes today. So do I want a future where corporate landlords own all the housing? Hell no. And nor do I think that private equity should be buying up these homes, but clearly my opinion isn't going to change that. But if something doesn't change, will the average American ever be able to own a home? What do you think is the ultimate solution to these rising house costs?
Yeah, I think ultimately it all comes down to supply and demand. I know I'm beating it like a dead horse, but I think it's important to set the stage of understanding like why we are where we are today, right? So since the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the US has chronically underbuilt housing. Coming out of it, everyone was so scared of owning a home because they saw their prices drop precipitously. And that supply side is even more exacerbated because of higher input costs, whether it's raw materials of lumber, higher wages, higher interest rates. And then you layer in the tremendous population growth that's happened in the last 10 years or so, both organic and inorganic through migration trends. So you have this very, very big imbalance. I think that on the demand side, it'll always be there. And the way that you address that is through policies, I think. We talked about Austin and how prolific building has been there. And so it's addressing zoning restrictions, right? Be able to accelerate permitting timelines to build these houses and incentivize for new construction.
Are people in their late 20s, 30s, 40s, are they ever going to be able to afford a home?
Fertility, not just in the US, but globally, has hit a historic low. So if you think about it, in 1 to 2 generations time, there's going to be less people today. And because of all the investment that's happening right now in building new homes through private equity, through home builders, right, you're going to have an opposite effect. You're going to have a lot of homes and less population. And so I think the pricing trend does reverse in 1 to 2 generations. And you see this in other places outside of the US. I'm sure you must have heard of ghost cities in China, where there are these big, beautiful, large developments that are entirely vacant because they built all this supply, but no one wants to live there or no one's living there.
Damn, I mean, that's pretty dark that it's going to take people not having kids anymore and for people to be able to afford a house.
Well, that's just one aspect of it, but there's so much unknown out there. One aspect is the great wealth transfer, right? And obviously this will only benefit a disproportionate aspect of Americans, but the millennials and Gen Z generations are set to inherit trillions and trillions of dollars, like $84 trillion by 2045, right? And so that's a lot of money to be inheriting. It's not even just the money, but it's also even the houses that are being inherited. And so obviously not everyone has, a rich mom and dad that they can inherit a house from. I'm certainly not one of them.
So I think one thing is clear. Private equity didn't create the housing crisis, but they've exploited it to gain outsized control. And whether you hate private equity or AI, the fact is, it frankly doesn't matter. Because while you're arguing about whether private equity is good or bad, they're buying the next 1,000 homes and probably using AI to help them find the best deals. And if you're hoping for vigilante violence to create change, then you're an idiot. The world is changing rapidly, but what will never change is that money and power has always shaped the rules of the game. And until you can see that for what it is, you'll continue to be a pawn in a world where those very forces are writing the rules. And if that's not the future you want, I think myself or you watching know deep down that you can no longer afford to be average. Because nowadays, it's pretty damn expensive to choose ignorance over acceptance and action. But the good news is that the whole point of this channel is to help you learn how you can use the money and power in your own way. And next week, I'll be diving even deeper into the housing crisis on my free email newsletter in the video description. But before it comes out, you first really need to understand why that might be difficult considering your rising national debt. So go and watch this video next to find out why that will most likely never be solved, and like and subscribe to keep on learning how money and power works.